May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. Well, we had to get the wise men up here. The lectionary would have had us skip over Epiphany, and we were supposed to celebrate it Friday. I could have had a service on Friday. How many of you would have been here? It's okay, Father Gary. Father Gary and I could have celebrated Epiphany on your behalf. But then we wouldn't get to sing these wonderful Epiphany hymns because the Magi have been sort of favorite characters for Christians for centuries. Our translation calls them wise men. Well, that's because we didn't actually want to call them sorcerers or astrologers. The Greek word at the time of Jesus referred to, we think, to Zoroastrian priests who specialized in the prophecy of the future through the interpretation of the stars and through the interpretation of dreams. Astrologers. I don't put a lot of shrift in astrology today, but maybe the ancient Zoroastrians knew more than the modern ones. Later, the word came to mean sorcerers. And that's not a good thing. How, early in Christian history, people decided that they must have been kings as well as astrologers. Perhaps because they saw in the coming of the Magi the fulfillment of some of the prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures about kings coming to pay homage to the Messiah. Or possibly because the gifts they brought were kingly. Or possibly, later on, because having kings come and make obeisance to Jesus sort of supported the whole divine right of kings theory that Europe had. For whatever reason, tradition decided they were kings. And so we have these figures with crowns and wonderful robes and jewels. It's hard to know how much of this story is historically accurate. The piece that does appear to be historically accurate is that King Herod was threatened by the idea of a descendant of David being born. Not clear to me whether the Herod referred to in today's reading was Herod the Great or his son Herod Antipas. But in either case, their claim to the throne of Judah, of Israel, did not come from the sort of legitimate line of descent. They were named king. Herod the Great was named king of the Jews by the general Octavian, later Caesar Augustus. He was only Jewish on his mother's side, and he was not a descendant of King David. And the Jewish scriptures had said that God made a promise to David that David's descendants would occupy the throne of Israel. And there's some other indications from the prophet Jeremiah, for example, that the Jews of the day sort of thought that this was one part of the covenant between God and Israel. And so Herod was sort of insecure on his throne. And, it's sort of like, did you know there are some people who say that King Charles III is not the rightful king of Great Britain? Because they hold that the transfer of the crown from the Jacobite kings to William and Mary was not legitimate. So over 300 years ago, the British Parliament decided to give the crown to Mary because she was Protestant, instead of to the son of Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was Catholic. There are people who can trace who would be King of England if that had not happened. Now, in our time, kings do not have a lot of real power. And there are not people in the streets with pitchforks and guns trying to change who the king of Great Britain is. That's not the case in ancient times. When Herod the Great died, there was an uprising, which was squashed with great brutality by the governor of Syria at the time, who crucified 2,000 Jewish men in retaliation. Imagine if the people who had invaded our capital 2 years ago, instead of being encouraged to leave peacefully and then tracked down and indicted and tried by a jury of their peers and maybe sentenced to some years in prison, if instead the army had come in and slaughtered them all. Herod was a rather brutal monarch, in addition to being a great architect, because people are not simple. So I think that the idea that if Herod learned that a baby had been born who was regarded as the legitimate heir of King David, that he would mean harm to that child, that probably is historically accurate. If the Magi had been more aware of the political currents of the place they were going to, they probably would not have started their quest with King Herod. What does this mean for us, though? Struggling with this. My professors in seminary said that we should try to preach, based on the actual biblical and historical facts. But here, I don't see a lot spiritually uplifting in these biblical and historical facts. I think perhaps the wise men, as we have transformed them in tradition, have more to say to us. the strangers who are prompted by something outside their understanding to see in Jesus someone more than just a baby born to an obscure family in another country. Gospels say that Jesus' birth was by the Holy Spirit. The angel appears to Mary. The angel appears to Joseph in the dream. Says, you'll be born by the Holy Spirit. And maybe the Holy Spirit was operating among these Zoroastrian astrologers too. I think maybe that's why this story has captured the imagination of the line of Christians that lead to us. Because, I know my ancestors, at least, were not Jews of Israel. My ancestors were barbarians up in the British Isles. Didn't know anything about King David, didn't know anything about the prophet Jeremiah. What they knew was that there were some men who came and told them about Jesus, told them about Christ, shared their food and their clothing with them, who shared stories of healing, shared moments of grace. The Holy Spirit was at work, and they saw in this Jesus Christ a manifestation of God's grace and power. Heard the story of the Magi, the story of other men far away, as strange to the barbarians of the British Isles as they were to the Jews of Bethlehem. They said, Jesus doesn't just belong to his time and place and people. He doesn't just belong to Jews. He doesn't just belong to people of Israel. He doesn't just belong to people who knew the Hebrew scriptures and who interpreted them. He belongs to us too. The same God and experience and Holy Spirit that led those Magi to Jesus is leading us to him. So they made up stories and songs. They gave them names. They decided there were 3 of them. Try to find that in the gospel. Eastern Church thinks there were 12. And maybe that, though, is the truth of the Magi. Not the historical truth, but the spiritual truth. That God works in mysterious ways to bring us to Jesus. That we don't have to be born to a particular group of people. We don't have to have learned about him from our father and mother. We just have to encounter that healing grace of God, whether in a star or a song or an experience of grace. We also can come to this strange person, this strange figure, historical and yet eternal, and have our lives transformed, and by grace transform our world.